All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining in to PitchCamp's Sales Leadership and Growth Leadership Series. I'm very excited, to have our 21st webinar on a consecutive week happening, and we have a lot of common participants joining in every week as part of these knowledge series. So today, let me take a minute, talk a little bit about PitchCamp, and then I'll welcome our key speaker of the day today. So PitchCamp is an initiative that we started 2020, right? Just before we hit COVID, and the whole idea of PitchCamp is to help people to share their ideas with the world better. With a primary focus is for entrepreneurs and sales teams. We offer investor pitch coaching and sales coaching for entrepreneurs and sales teams. So we are embarking on a very new partnership opportunity shortly. So I'm excited to announce some new partnerships in the coming weeks. We have also struck a partnership with Draper Startup House, who is our fund syndicate partner. That startups that go through our investor pitch programs, they get to pitch in front of Draper Startup House fund syndicate. So with this, I would like to once again welcome all of you. Thanks for taking time on a Friday evening. And I'm super excited to host Prakhar from Whatfix. He's a Director of Global Sales. Welcome, Prakhar. Thank you so much for joining in today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks a lot for hosting me, Bimlesh.
Fantastic. Prakhar, so talk to us a little bit about your background and where you started your career, and were you into sales before? How did you get into Whatfix? So just talk us through a little bit of that journey before we jump into talking exciting things about experiments.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I started my career right after my MBA when I joined a startup. So my MBA was actually from a B school, which was quite focused on entrepreneurship. It had a tie-up with the Entrepreneurship Development Institute of India, and the entire program was all about startup. So I got the startup bug right from college, passed out as a gold medalist, and joined a 6 people company. Again, I was actually doing business analysis, digital marketing, and everything related to business analysis and analytics. I was pretty much the first business guy in that 6-member team. Grew to about 70, 80 people, several $1 million in ARR when I decided to do something of my own. So I was actually working on a own startup idea, which was more like in the online laundry space. And when I was starting that, it was very early ideation phase when I had the blueprint ready when Whatfix happened. So one of the founders of Whatfix, Vara, actually reached out to me saying that, hey, we are building something for the global stage, and why don't you come on board with us? And the idea of Whatfix was more around a product being out there which could be sold to anybody globally, any business horizontally to different departments, and could really solve a problem at a global stage. And whereas my idea that I was trying was more into a hyper-local startup, more focused towards the B2C market. So this idea excited me a lot. I actually was hired as a marketeer because that's what my background was. I was not hired as a sales guy, but it's a very holacratic sort of an environment early in a startup when you're wearing multiple hats and doing several things at the same time. And 2 months down the line, my CEO Khadim actually felt that I was more a sales guy. So I was actually sort of brainwashed into sales. I never really felt that I was somebody who could do sales. And yeah, I've never looked back. 6 years, about 6 years of this journey with Whatfix, from a time when I was hired as the first employee. We had 4 customers back then, and now we have 650 globally, about 100 Fortune 1000 companies using our product, a 400-member team, and a lot of journey-related memories tied up to it as well. So I don't think I can today, if I look at the entire experience, I don't think I can do anything apart from sales.
Okay, wonderful, excellent. So talk to us about the early days of of you joining Whatfix. What did you see, and your initial sales challenges? Right from you mentioned that this was a product that would work for every organization, every department, right? It's like a one-size-fit-all approach. But then when you try to sell it to specific customers, you got to make it relevant to them and not sound a very generic, solution. So talk to us a little bit of your initial first few wins, and we'll take it forward from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the early stage, the challenge until a company has actually achieved a product market fit is to identify who the ideal customers really are, right? Like, it's good and bad at the same time when you can actually sell it to everybody because you don't know who's your low hanging fruit. Like when I came on board, we had only 4 customers, and initial customers, as you know, are mostly friends and family, and through your investor network and through your referral network. So you don't really know if they've actually purchased your product because it's really solving a pain point for them, or they have actually done it just for you. Right. So to get the initial product market fit, you need a lot more, and that's where a lot of experiments actually began, where the initial approach that we were targeting was to startups. So we felt every startup who had a website and a free trial on the website would worry a lot about their trial to conversion ratios. Hundreds of people sign up, on SaaS platforms globally throughout different businesses and categories. But the conversion is only up to an extent, and every marketer or marketing head or the sales head is actually thinking about how I can work on these conversions in a product-led growth sort of a scenario. So that was our first experiment when I actually started reaching out to startups and tried pitching our product. Again, it took a while for us to realize that while that was a problem statement that needed to be solved, they did not see the value as much as some of the other markets did, or some of the other categories of buyers did. So we were able to sell to an extent, and we felt that was the product market fit we had achieved when we got to 20, 25 initial customers for smaller use cases. But I think the big one, or the breakthrough for us, was when we realized that there are so many applications internally in organizations that employees use on a daily basis. And these are multi-million-dollar deployments that companies are paying for. So this is a much bigger pain point to solve, where the budgets are easily available. People want to invest in this technology. And then we actually took that route. Of course, I summed it up, a 4-year experiment, fail, learn, execute sort of a journey in a few seconds. But the gist was that, initially we started more catered towards startup, and then that slowly evolved when we realized that they may not be the best fit for us.
So when you moved this to the enterprise segment, what experiments did you run to identify between mid-size enterprises versus large-size enterprises?
Right, great question. So I think in the early days, one of the initial breakthroughs I can remember was with one of the Fortune companies that we actually got in touch with, and the buyer actually got so sold on the product that it was more like an outsourced product manager for us, that we got so much good intel from that person that helped us understand the buyer behavior and what sort of problems we could solve for so many other Fortune companies in a similar ballgame. So that was a really good one for us. Another breakthrough was that we got Google on board. That was a task. But when a company like Google comes in, starts working with you, when you are just a 20-member team, the whole world wants to work with you and wants to understand what Google is trying to achieve. So we really banged on that a lot in terms of what the use case was and how we wanted to actually help companies in a similar manner of how we're doing it with Google. And everybody wanted to follow. So that was one of the key breakthroughs in the early days. Of course, the process was tough. You have to be smart in being able to understand how do you get an entry, because there would be a lot of security requirements that you have to meet. There would be a lot of compliance requirements. The pricing has to be a particular standard, the legal requirements, the indemnity clauses, all of that. So you have to be creative to find your way around how do you get that foot in the door. But once you do, I think it opens a lot more doors.
Right. How did you manage your pricing and positioning when you moved into this particular segment? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been a very gradual process of scaling that. I think when we started selling our product, we started selling at $99 a month. The same product now we sell at $500,000 ARR as well. So it's not a lot that has changed apart from the value that we have realized and the positioning we have changed and the pitch that has changed for different set of buyers. It has been a very gradual process, I would say. It's not happened overnight. It's also come with a lot of market maturity, our understanding of the buyers' challenges, and positioning our product accordingly. So as and when we kept on acquiring more customers, we had more data in terms of what was the real ROI we were actually driving for them. So in a lot of cases, we would see that, hey, for let's say a $1,200 license that we have sold for the entire year, the actual value is basically 100x of that. Because if we are saying that, hey, your support queries of an organization, let's say, came down by 60% and they were getting 10,000 queries a month, the typical cost of solving a support query industry standard is between $8 to $32. So again, it's a simple math of, hey, these are the number of queries being saved. This is the actual dollar value cost of your support tickets. This is the before, this is the after scenario. So that gave us a lot of data and insights into that, hey, we can't price our product, which is giving a 100x ROI. One is it's unbelievable. You go pitch the same thing to a larger enterprise and they'll be like, okay, either you're crazy or you're not going to survive with us long term because you don't know how to price your product. So I think all that data sort of gave us a lot of insights into how we wanted to build a model on top of what we had and slowly scale from there. So from $1,000, it directly did not go to 100,000. It was a gradual phase where we actually increased the base price to, let's say, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000. So right now our base is around 10 to 12K ARR. And then it grew from there in terms of, again, who we are selling to, the ROI we are delivering, and so on.
All right. Fantastic. So talk to us a little about, about the, the team structure experiments that you ran. Obviously when we have a couple of founders as well whom I recognize who have joined it, right? Initially you would tend to hire, generalists who just, try to set the ball rolling, right? And once you hit a product market fit, and also when demand picks up, either through references or now your awareness has increased, PR has worked, you also start getting a lot of inbounds. So talk to us a little bit about this evolution of how you set up your teams towards catering to high demand.
Sure. Actually, before I answer this question, I would just go back to the previous one because I really thought of an important point which might be useful to our audience. For a lot of companies, pricing strategy also becomes easier when you look at the market and see your competitors on how they are pricing it. For us, that was not so much an option because we play in a very niche category and there are not a lot of players out there. So when you are playing in a very new category and people have not heard about you enough, you have to create your own playbook. And ROI was one of the ways we actually looked at, the value we were delivering, and then we did a backward math of pricing our product. I think another thing we did consider then was also about the actual price of the product itself. So like, let's say if a company was paying X dollars per user per month to Salesforce, and we are going to be ramping their users faster by, let's say, 3 times, and the support queries would come down by X, how much can we price the per user model? We actually went on those lines as well. But yeah, I think very useful. On your next question, of course, when we start, you start with a generalist. Like I was not even a sales guy, so I was pretty much learning the nuances of how to go about things. But what helped me a lot in the early days is that while I was my own SDR, BDR, AE, customer success guy, the invoicing guy, even the legal guy myself, I think what helped is that marketing mindset that I had. Because again, our product was not mainstream. So people were looking for, the problem was there. People are looking for 10 different ways to solve a problem, but we were not one of them because they haven't even heard of this technology. They can't even think that this exists. So it was a marketing challenge. So when I was talking to our clients, it was more about education more than the sales process. So I would think like a marketeer, but sell like a salesperson. And that helped a lot, where the marketing language is never salesy. It's all about, generating interest and getting you closer to why this would help you. And then the angle comes in when you actually start talking about the value, etc. So I used to have a mix. I think when you grow in your business, there are a lot of business triggers that sort of help you understand when is the right time to get to specialization. Like I'll give you two examples that would be very clearly able to help. One is in the SDR process, we had a typical conversion ratio that I started with. And I started seeing that when I would measure my performance on a graph, it would actually be a wave. Now, it would be a wave because 1 month I would be performing really well, depending on our sales cycle when the pipelines were set. And next month, it would actually come down. Another month, I would do really well. And another month, it would come down again. And what was actually happening in this case is that as soon as I would have a pipeline, I realized my entire focus would be on closing it. Because, of course, as sales guys, you get motivated by the dollar values coming in. And then next month, my pipeline is all squeezed out. So I don't have enough. So now I'm trying to focus and build a pipeline. And that's why that wavy performance. So the clear indication was, okay, let's get an SDR in so that that graph now becomes a hockey stick in the other direction. Okay, so we got the first SDR hire where now they could focus only on actually building a pipeline. I could focus only on closing. Another example was that we very clearly knew that from a support process, if you actually look at it, we were handling support ourselves. One of the key metrics for us was that we wanted to make sure that the deployments become successful, not only from churn and retention perspective, but just because our product has huge potential to expand in the same organization itself. Now, as a sales guy, when I'm focused on new business, I am not that focused, or my interest in a customer who's already in is not at the same level what a new customer gives me the high of, right? So that was a clear trigger again, that the value that can actually go to these customers and the engagement that we are providing, we never wanted to build a support model. We wanted to build a success model. Support is reactive, success is proactive.
Right.
That we were never able to do with one person doing it all. So that was the second trigger, that time to, have a support guy in who can actually do it. And when we continue to scale at different journeys of 0 to 1, 1 to 10, and from there, every time we kept on getting triggers that would help us understand this very, very clearly. Like it was around, the one role that I see right now has now transformed into a 60-member team, which one person was doing. And now we have BDRs, we have SDRs, we have sales engineers, we have solution architects. Now we have a separate team who does upsells and expansions, because it's all about getting those business triggers. Like another trigger for us was the same rep who actually used to work on hunting and farming was more focused on farming, because farming at our end was much, much easier. The sales cycles are 3 times shorter, and you would of course want to focus on that existing account because it's just so easier to dive in. But then when you have structured a quota a particular way, your new business is getting hit, because now you're not getting the same conversion what you should in the new business segment as well. So you would see the conversion dip there, but the guy is still doing 2x, 3x of their quotas. So again, so I think a lot of companies, I would say the takeaway here for a lot of companies and folks might be that even sometimes when your metrics and data looks really, really glamorous, dive deeper to just sort of understand what more can still be improved, and paranoid about how we can do better. Because for us, if we just looked at the P&L and looked at the total numbers, yeah, it was very glamorous. But there was a hidden trigger in there that, hey, new business can really be a separate team, and this upsell and expansion could be a separate team. We can do more than what we are doing right now.
You brought up a very interesting point on triggers, Prakhar. So talk to us about some of the experiments that that you started with these triggers, or some of the experiments that generated some new triggers, and how did you run these experiments while you were trying to meet your quotas and stuff? I think that's a very interesting puzzle, that I am curious on, and I'm sure many folks who have joined in today also would be interested.
Yeah, there's a very thin line between how you actually maintain what's going on as well as continue to try extra. And for that, it needs time, it needs focus, and it needs more than just the normal routine work. So I think one thing that was common and that's ingrained as a part of our culture is that quota is just a baseline. You don't care about your quotas. I mean, you have to meet quotas, and everybody does so on the team. It's about how can I get to 2x, that's what the target always is. So that worst case, you actually land up at your base level of the quota. So when you're doing that, a lot of experiments and creativity comes from within that. As and when you start understanding the buyer behavior more, the dynamics of business more, every day would be a new venture. Like I'll give you an example. When we started selling with monthly payment options. Now we clearly understood that with monthly, for smaller enterprises, it's fine. But with larger enterprises, when we actually started selling to some larger companies, they started asking us like, can't you do annual? Because that's an accounting pain for us. And then we were like, yeah, absolutely, we can. And then slowly we started realizing that it's not only an accounting pain for them, it's actually a good way for us to, lock customers in and have more time with them to showcase the value better. Because in a monthly sort of an environment, these are more risk averse customers, right? They don't want to get locked in a duration and see, but once they've seen the results, they are more than excited to sort of be with you long term and pay you, because nobody wants to do this accounting pain for anybody. So the trigger for us was some of these conversations, and what we did then was slowly started moving our monthly to quarterly, where we changed our pricing model to quarterly. Now we only have 3-year contracts and we only have annual payments. So this slow transition has actually led to there, where companies like to work that way. It's just about positioning your product value and asking for it. See, like a typical conversation, and you learn a lot from your customers, by the way. All these experiments have actually come from customer insights. Like I remember a conversation with one of our early clients, without naming them, and they were more like, do you do contracts more than 1 year? And we were like, yeah, absolutely, we do. And they started asking about how is the pricing model structured? Do you have discounts when you do the contracting for a larger duration? How does that work? Give me the details, etc. And then it was a curious question because we did not have so much idea, and nobody in our team was so much from a SaaS background who would understand the dynamics of how this works. Again, a simple question was that I completely understand, but does that make the entire business process easier for you if we do a long-term engagement? And the simple answer was that, hey, we are going to be using your product on Salesforce. Salesforce is a 5-year contract for us. So that's not going anywhere. So if that's not going anywhere, I don't see that we will not require your product in the long run as well. And that was a clear pitch for us. Now, for every Salesforce customer who wanted to use our product on that, that's the exact thing that we would say, that, hey, your Salesforce is going to be staying there for long. So it's about learning a lot from your customers also, and then using those cues as a part of your pitch. So that was one big one, the entire transition from monthly to now 3-year contracts. I think some of the others was just related to payment collection was another one, on how we were able to automate that. Earlier, of course, it was a manual process, and how we went about it. We've never had challenges related to it, but again, a lot of automation that we did there, like one of the automation experiments, I'll tell you, this is more on the internal stakeholder side than the external. But typical handover process from sales to customer success was that a sales guy closes the deal, and we get on a call, the customer success person is on, and then we have 3-4 people on the call trying to explain everything that we can. We have handover sheets created in Excel, and all of that is basically being filled. The knowledge transfer is happening, and then we set up an onboarding call. Similarly, finance would come in, ask us the details of the contract. We will send the signed contract over. They would generate an invoice. What we were able to do over time is, now we use Salesforce as our CRM, and now with Salesforce, we have automated all of this. So as soon as you basically win a deal, an automated email trigger basically goes to the whole company with a celebratory note. The next email goes to finance that, hey, this customer has come in. These are the details of the contract. Generate an invoice, which is tied up to QuickBooks, which is our accounting system that automatically triggers an invoice creation. Then we have tied this to client success, which is our customer success tool, which automatically fills in all the relevant fields with the information that a customer success manager would require, and send them a trigger to assign a relevant CSM for that geography, market segment, and so on. So that entire process that used to take 2 hours and a lot of back and forth, etc., is all automated. Nobody talks to each other unless there are some exceptions. So I think a lot of this over time came with experiments and the know-how of how we can do more, and staying paranoid about how we can, make this whole process more and more streamlined.
Fantastic. Amazing. What are some of the experiments that failed? So far we have touched upon a lot of nice things that have worked, and I'm
Yeah.
sure nice things don't come without certain things not working out as well. So talk to
Absolutely.
us about some experiments that didn't work, and what were some of the lessons that you learned as you were scaling up.
Yeah. So one thing that did not work as well for us is so when we actually started growing, we started feeling that training was a big market for us. Okay, and everybody related to the training persona was somebody who was very relevant, who would actually want to buy our product. Now, again, this is all about being surface level and not getting into the weeds. Now, thinking that, we actually spent a decent amount of marketing budget on certain training events that were happening globally, and some of the largest events on the planet. We actually set up our booth, attended, etc. But the response was not positive. Our learning from those events and the spend was that training is such a huge gamut in itself that our product was a fit only for technology training. However, when you look at training as a function, it can include soft skills training, it can include process training, instruction training, manual training, hardware training,
Right.
leadership training, and so on. And we did not understand that before the event, that when a training event happened, it's actually encompassing everything. It's not, technology is just very minute subset of it. So that was one learning for us, that whenever you're actually doing your messaging on the marketing side, or you're doing your messaging on the or you want to attend a particular event, it has to be niche and custom to the specific technology training audience. That was one of the learnings. I think another experiment I can think of is we tried a lot of agencies early in the early days to sort of help us with, let's say, leads or opportunities that they create, etc. And that was at a time when our product market fit was itself shaky. We were not really sure ourselves. So one of the biggest learnings there was that when you yourself are not clear about the product market fit, and you're trying different experiments, an external agency or source will not be able to help you to an extent that you want them to. It will always be a failed experiment. We tried it twice, thrice in different ways in different agencies, but none worked for us because we ourselves had so little knowledge that we could share only so much with them, and they could only do so much for us. I mean, I'm not saying agencies are bad. This does not mean that, but it does mean that at a stage when we tried it, it did not work for us at all. I think one of the others I can think of is that when we were trying to structure the team, we've tried different ways in how we've tried to structure it. So in the initial days, we had the SDR reporting into sales. Right now, we have the SDRs and BDRs reporting into marketing. The reason we did
Okay.
Yes, the reason we did that shift is that typically when SDRs, BDRs report into sales, it's always a ball game and argument around, hey, I gave you these many leads and only these were qualified and only these convert into opportunities and so on. And even before that could start at our end, we realized that it is bound to happen in the future. So we restructured and did it in a way that it started reporting into marketing. And the reason for that is now marketing is completely focused on generating opportunities for us. So they could get 10,000 leads, give us only 100 opportunities, but if 100
Right.
is looking for, that works for us. So then that entire conversation goes away of, you generate X leads and these sources work and these don't, etc. So sales is saving a lot of time, completely focused on closures. And now BDRs, SDRs work with marketing. While there is, of course, a lot of overlap from a process perspective because it's still sales, but they still report into marketing from a reporting and number and metric standpoint.
Very interesting, Prakat. This is a great insight here, because this obviously reduces friction between teams when you're trying to look at handoffs, right? Like as you rightly said, right? This also helps in very strongly defining what your MQL's exit criteria is and your SQL entry criteria is, right? So thereby there's less conflict, less dispute, especially when incentives and especially when incentives have to be calculated and structured. That's
Right.
fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, on this particular topic, talk to us about some of your, if it's okay with you to share some of your MQL SQLs that have worked for you, as to what do you consider as a good opportunity that flows through the funnel for the sales team, and what do you qualify at that point of time as your key identifiers or your key markers in your pipeline from a sales point of view?
Yeah. So I think it keeps on evolving at different stages of the business. So when you start as a startup and your marketing or inbound marketing is just taking off, you want to talk to anyone and everyone. I mean, of course, you want to filter out some noise in terms of interns and students just wanting to know more about your product. But apart from that, if it's a business person you're talking to, I think you should talk to them. It just gives you perspective on what you can do better, and if time permits, of course. So initial days, we did not have any qualification at all when we started. There was no concept of MQL, SQL. We used to get 2 leads a week. I mean, we could not afford to have a qualification in place. And that would be by Gmail addresses that we would try to convert into opportunities and so on. Slowly it evolved when we actually started saying that, okay, if we were implementing the BANT process, budget, authority, need, and timeline, let's just look at need. Forget the rest of it. Forget the BAT. Let's just look at N. If N is there, let's talk to them. Now that's how we started evolving slowly when the volume started stabilizing and we had a consistent momentum building up. Then we started saying, okay, now let's add a T to it as well. So now we will be looking at N and T. Then slowly we started adding A to it as well. And now it's at a point that we do a complete band, and then we have a mid pick as well now, which is now gone much deeper into how we understand our buyers. So I think it's evolved over a period of time at different stages. When your volume is low, you don't want to be very harsh on qualification. You want to let whatever is coming in and see what you can make the most out of.
We have one question that's come in, I think right at the point of MQL SQL. Way to generate an inbound when there is no large marketing budget. How do you generate inbounds when there is no marketing budgets?
Yes, really good question. A lot of ways actually. See, there has to be some budget, I would say. If your budget is hardly any, then the only thing I can think of is taking the content route. Content marketing could be one of the ways that could help. I used to write a lot of articles myself in the early days, just so I could promote our category and the product and what it does, etc. I would write on Medium SEO articles. Again, that marketing knowledge used to help me a lot, where I could use the entire SEO knowledge that I had gained in my previous role to write relevant articles on certain topics that would start showing up when people were searching for certain keywords. I think that could be one of the ways to go about it. You have specific niche communities that could be relevant buyers for you. You want to go and have conversations there, etc. But again, it's a dedicated job. It's a long process. Nothing kicks in overnight. And without a budget, to be honest, it's hard to sort of scale to a level where you can scale a company. So at least to get the product market fit, yes, there are a lot of ways in content marketing, participating in discussions on, let's say, LinkedIn groups. If you have a product that, like for us, it was Salesforce, Workday communities, etc., where we would go participate in discussions and let people know more about our product and so on. But yeah, mostly social media and content. I can't think of anything else.
I'll add another piece there. You could do webinars like these, bring in people together, on the focus area of your product, and this could be a great way for both brand building and also for potential, leads that you generate to qualify to see which one of these leads will actually be a good fit for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any learning on selling to US market from India? How should we set up process for international market? This is from Tapesh, who is the founder of Nimesa.
Yeah, I think Tapesh, the first part is to just understand the market a little more on how big is the market for you in US, how many players already exist, what is the differentiation you have created with your product offering, and how do you want to position it? Because a lot of US is a highly competitive market. It's hard to crack if you do not have a lot of differentiation. So even the slightest of differentiation, if you have, there are ways to actually penetrate that market. It's a highly risk-seeking market, so your entry might be easier compared to other markets if your product talks for itself and the differentiation is there. And of course, I mean, this could itself be a 2 or 3 hour webinar in itself on how do you set up the process and how do you go about. Lot of detailed nuances to actually how you go about it. The smallest of things makes a difference. Like one is just getting a US office in place with even a PO box. That sort of helps. Without that, in the early days, it can be hard for you to completely sell remote. Second could be your seller has to have some US experience to be able to understand your buyers, understand the culture a little bit, and talk their language. Third is, are you providing 24/5 support or not? That's one of the key requirements in the early days for, even though your team is small, the companies in US would expect that if they are actually buying from a remote organization. So I mean, high level, I can tell you some of these things, but yeah, it's very deep. You have a lot of factors that actually are needed to set up a process.
Next question is from Mano. How do you allocate leads to sales team? Round robin or skill or geo?
Yeah, we have a mix of a lot of stuff. So right now we have reps actually serving SMB enterprise in the large enterprise market. SMB for us is lesser than 1,000 employees. Then we have enterprise between 1,000 to 5,000, and large enterprises for us are 5,000 employees plus. So we have different teams working on these categories, and we have two motions, inbound and outbound. In the inbound sales motion, it's typically round robin, depending on the geography and the market segment you belong to. And then in the outbound, you have certain accounts given to you, which you actually work on and generate opportunities yourself. So you do end-to-end in those cases, supported by a BDR team as well.
Next one is from Navneet. Do you see a difference in buying behavior from customers across geographies? If so, how do you prepare your team for it?
Yeah, very actually. Each of these geographies are very, very different culturally as well as from a buying behavior perspective. So I think it's very important to understand. See, US, as I said, is a more risk-seeking, individualistic economy. So you have to focus on what's the motivation for the buyer. More than if you are doing a feature-based pitch, it will pretty much fall flat in the US market. You have to do a value-based solution selling approach, trying to understand their requirements first and then positioning your product for it. Again, the motivation of the individual is most important on why they are looking at your product, and they will be the ones who would actually sell your product internally. You can rely a lot on doing that in US. In Europe, it's very different. Again, Europe itself is a mix of like 10, 15 different cultures. In the Nordics, you would see more people are straightforward. They would tell you, what they feel about your product, etc. Again, the market maturity is lesser compared to how US operates. You can trust your champion, but they would probably not put their job on the line and sell your product internally like US guys would. So EU is slightly different that way. But of course, in EU, there are very typical nuances to a UK market versus, a market like a Germany or a France, where things are very different. Germans actually are slightly more conservative in terms of how they want to purchase products, and they prefer a lot of local support and local language support. Same for the French market as well. If you come to APAC, broadly again, APAC you would look at, I think each of them have their own cultures. Japan and China are completely different world altogether. They have their own ways of how they purchase products. Partner route is a great way to enter some of these markets. If you look at Southeast Asia, again, as mature as India in terms of how the buyer behavior is, very similar, but again, nuances to them as well. How we typically handle is there are separate teams handling each, and there's a culture training happening for each of these. So as a new hire, when someone comes in, we of course try to understand their background, and then of course, depending on the geo they would be selling to, we have some form of culture training as a part of it as well. Long answer to the short. I wanted to add.
No, that's important. That's important because culture sensitivity and local geopolitics, economic factors, competitors in that local regions as well. A lot of these things play a factor. One in understanding and also on how you equip your teams to handle objections.
Right? Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Fantastic. We have another question from Sahil Gupta. For outbound, usually how many leads accounts would you recommend to be assigned to one SDR focused on selling in US where the ACV of the product is 20K USD?
I think hard question for me to answer just looking at the ACV, Sahil. What I would say is it also depends on how many personas can you sell to in a particular account. Also depends on how large accounts do you sell to, like how large are these companies. See, if you're selling to startups in a 200 employee range, then that number could be really high. It could be even 500 accounts for that matter, because the personas you would be reaching out to would be much lesser. If you reach out to Fortune companies, where one company can have 50,000 employees and you can potentially have 1,000 buyers, then yeah, even 10 accounts might be high. So again, it's a lot of different factors that would help us arrive at how many leads or accounts would be the ideal number. But yeah, some of the ways to actually go about it would be trying to understand how many personas can you sell to in an organization. What's your typical sales cycle? Again, looking at some of that, and yeah, if it is a new business versus farming and so on.
Usually 2 to 3 personas, CIO, CFO, VPIT, companies with 200 to 2,000 employees with annual revenues being 100 million to 1 billion.
Got it. Yeah. So in this form of a case, without doing any specific math, I think you can easily have about 200 to 300 accounts easily at one time. And of course, you can decide a time frame of how long a rep actually gets to hold it. In terms of the performance, how many touch points they've had, what's the response rate, what's the email open rate, getting to the bottom of basically how many touch points were created, because these accounts also will fuel your inbound in the long run, if not in the short run. So I think that's another way to look at it. Again, depending on your sales cycle, you can decide how long you want to keep it, whether it's 3 months is the ideal time or 6 months and so on.
Awesome, Prakhar. I think the last topic that I wanted to cover was on your org structures, right? So what are the org structures that you experimented with, and where did you find your maximum success? And I'm sure the successful org structure is relevant as of now, which might again change in the future again. But talk to us a little bit about your org structures.
Yeah, so we've not done a very good job on org structures, I must say. At least in the early days we didn't. Now it's stabilizing to a level where we can say that things are in place. Like I'll tell you, starting this January, I had 21 people directly reporting into me. And I almost survived, basically almost was saved that my wife didn't divorce me. It was of that sort, because you would get yourself to a level where you just can't manage, right? One person managing 21 people is just not scalable at all. I think there are layers needed that help. So I think right now we actually experimented more the island model that you say that, everybody reports into the one person, and because you want to say that, hey, everybody's conversion should be great, etc. But as you grow and if you want to achieve scale, there are layers that need to come in that sort of help you scale as well. So you have to continue to think that how can you create your next level and form the structure. A typical assembly line is what we are on right now, which is more like, I am the director of global sales, so I take care of the entire inbound and outbound globally, and then I have layers of associate directors and managers for inbound, outbound, different regions and so on, and then they have their own teams. But again, that model evolved with time, where some of our top performers actually up to be a manager, and then they were able to scale their teams and replicate their own successes. So that was one thing that we did in sales. In BDRs, SDRs, we've done something very similar. And I think this is the model that's actually working right now. We have specialized it to a level where one person will not do 3 things at a time. And if they say that we have a lot of time on hand, we have always believed that when you actually go into specialization and go deeper, there is so much to do in your current role itself. Like I'll give you just a simple example of a person with 100 accounts may not have any opportunities, but there is just so much to research in those 100 accounts and know more about them and understand them that you'll never be free. So we've always believed that just because someone has time, don't make them do 2 or 3 roles that a lot of companies tend to do to save costs. That, okay, let this person do hunting as well or farming as well, or let them open partner channels as well. but it doesn't work long term, because then you are not doing that with focus. You are probably doing that just to kill time and fill that gap in between. But as soon as your core starts working, which ultimately it does for everybody, you start losing focus on everything that you had started on the sides. So then your entire experiment that you wanted to do as a focused approach also seems like it failed. But in the first place, what I believe is it wasn't done in the right way anyway. So I think the learning for us was always create specialization from the early days. Yes, people might be more idle than they seem, but when they get into specialization, the results you would see long term would be just very, very different.
One related question is, can you explain a little more about your sales team structure and marketing team structure?
Yeah, sales structure I think is very clear, as I explained on the assembly line piece, and marketing is very similar as well. We have a team of BDRs, SDRs. There is one-to-one BDRs for us is the demand gen team, who is doing the cold calling, cold emailing, etc., to prospects to create awareness and opportunities, and that is one-on-one pairing with our named accounts team, which is the outbound that we have. It's more a mentoring relationship. Again, in BDR, we have a director who basically takes care of this. Similarly, for the SDR team, we have a senior manager who takes care of the SDR team as well. And this entire reports into the head of demand gen.
Great conversation, Prakhar. I think we'll come to an end here. Prakhar, thank you so much. This was wonderful conversation. I'm very glad that we could cover everything that we thought of, and thank you for patiently responding, and thank you to the audience for asking some wonderful, insightful questions. Thanks for taking time. Thanks, Prakhar, once again for coming on PitchCamp.
Thanks a lot, Vimlesh. My pleasure, and I hope the audience really found it useful in terms of some of the answers, and yeah, hope it helped.